What was the ancestry of the first three presidents of the United States of America, and what do we know about their DNA haplogroups? First up is the most famous one, of course, George Washington, who became the first president of the United States on the 30th of April 1789 and was in office until 1797. But what do we know about his ancestry? Well, George Washington was primarily of English descent, but there was other influences as well. He was born in 1732 in Pope's Creek in the Virginia colony of British America. His father was Augustine Washington and his mother was Mary Ball Washington, who were both born in Virginia themselves. His roots were largely English though. As the first president wrote himself in a letter in 1792, the Washingtons originated in one of the northern counties of England. To be more specific, the family's roots can be traced back to the 12th century to a town called Washington in the Sunderland district of northeast England. This is part of the historic County Durham, and the ancestral home of the Washington family still stands today, called Washington Old Hall. The early version of this hall was bought by William de Hepburn, who moved into the manor in 1183, and who was an ancient ancestor of George Washington. Now, William is thought to have been a knight of Norman descent, and we know the name William was brought into England by the Normans in general, obviously William the Conqueror and various other examples of this. William is also thought to have had a Scottish connection, as he is said to be a descendant of the Crann the Thane of Dunkeld, the hereditary abbot of the monastery of Dunkeld, and the son-in-law of Malcolm II of Scotland. So the Washington family have this Scottish connection as well, it seems. But where does the name Washington come from then? Well, William de Hepburn would soon adopt the name of the new manor he just bought in England, which was known as Wessington at the time. He thus became known as William de Wessington. In the 16th century, a branch of the family settled in Northamptonshire in central England, and by this time, Wessington had morphed into Washington, with Lawrence Washington becoming a prosperous wool merchant of Northamptonshire in the 16th century. It is quite interesting as well how surnames can change slightly over time, with Wessington becoming Washington. Without this change as well, the capital of the United States of America today would be known as Washington, D.C. The footprints of the Washington family can be seen across other parts of England as well. In Selby Abbey in Yorkshire, England, there is a medieval stained glass window bearing the coat of arms of the Washington family, namely 3 red stars above 2 red bands on a white shield. The window was probably dedicated to John Wessington, a 15th century prior of Durham and a collateral ancestor of George Washington. The English Civil War of the 17th century between the Royalists and the Parliamentarians had a major impact on the Washington family, however. Many of the Washingtons had Royalist sympathies, and this was the losing side in the Civil War. Between political instability and financial troubles, John Washington, who lived between 1633 and 1677, ended up emigrating to America. How John actually got to America isn't quite as straightforward as you may have thought. John was a merchant back in England and only emigrated to Virginia by way of a merchant ship destined for the colony of Virginia, running aground in the Potomac River. Although the ship was repaired, John Washington decided to stay in the colony of Virginia, and he was the paternal great-grandfather of George Washington, the first president of the United States of America. John went on to marry Anne Pope, the daughter of a prominent Virginia plantation owner, Lieutenant Colonel Nathaniel Pope, who also had English roots. On George's mother's side as well, the Ball family, there was also strong English ties. The father of George's mother, Mary Ball Washington, was Joseph Ball, who was born in Halifax, West Yorkshire, England. So George Washington had strong English roots, and he was actually related to some English royals as well. Through his paternal grandmother, George Washington was descended from King Edward III, the King of England from 1327 until his death in 1377. Interestingly to note as well, George Washington was also a distant relation of Queen Elizabeth II, who died just in 2022. They were second cousins 7 times removed, connected through Colonel Augustine Warner Jr. Washington also had a little French ancestry as well. A French ancestor of his was Nicolas Marchais, for instance, a Frenchman who emigrated to the English colony of Virginia in the 17th century. But what do we know about George Washington's haplogroups? Well, a study just from earlier this year looked at this precise question. They predicted that George Washington would have had the Y-DNA haplogroup RU152, a variation of R1b. This is the same haplogroup that Abraham Lincoln belonged to, also it is believed. RU152 is considered an Italo-Celtic branch of R1b historically, but it is found across various parts of Europe today, including in the UK and Ireland. This table shows the top surnames who belong to the haplogroup RU152, with Smith, Miller and Johnston at the top of the list. According to 23andMe's database at least. George Washington's mitochondrial haplogroup is less clear, unfortunately. But what about the ancestry and DNA of the other early presidents of the United States? Well, next up is John Adams, who served as the second president of the United States between 1797 and 1801. Adams was born in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1735 and he hailed from a Puritan background, with his ancestors emigrating from England to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the early 17th century. The Adams family, not that Adams family though, were originally from Somerset, England, and were part of the Puritan movement, which sought to reform the Church of England. An important ancestor of the second president of the United States was Henry Adams, who was one of the earliest settlers of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Henry was born in Somerset, England in 1583 before he migrated over the Atlantic in the 1630s. Now, as well as having strong English roots, John Adams also had a Welsh connection. One of the earliest references to his family comes in 1422 in relation to one of his distant ancestors, John Adams of Pembroke in Wales. As far as haplogroups, it seems that John Adams belonged to R1b1 on the Y-DNA side. As anyone who has seen any of my previous videos will know, the spread of R1b across Europe is associated with migrations from the Pontic-Caspian steppe connected to the Yamnaya culture beginning around 5,000 years ago. This haplogroup is very common in Western Europe today, but it's quite remarkable to think that this haplogroup then found its way across the pond and into the United States of America. Now, Adam's mitochondrial DNA haplogroup isn't known, unfortunately, again, but it wouldn't be surprising if it was a variation of H, as this is very common in England as I went through in my video on English DNA. Next up is another giant of American history, Thomas Jefferson, who served as the third president of the United States of America between 1801 and 1809. Now, Jefferson was born in 1743 in Shadwell in the Virginia colony. He was again mainly of English descent, but he also had some ancestral ties to both Scotland and Wales. His mother, Jane Randolph, was a member of the influential Randolph family, which descended from English nobility. The Randolphs were among Virginia's wealthiest and most powerful families, and they held a notable influence over the colony's social and political landscape. William Randolph I was a notable figure in the family's history, as he was born in England but emigrated to the colony of Virginia in the 17th century. Now, the Randolph family potentially had a Scottish connection as well, as, according to some sources at least, the family are said to be connected to the Lord Regent of Scotland, Thomas Randolph, the first Earl of Moray. Thomas Randolph lived between 1285 and 1332, and was a soldier and diplomat in the Wars of Scottish Independence. He was a nephew of Robert the Bruce, who was the one who made him the first Earl of Moray. I should note, however, that others do dispute this connection between Thomas Randolph of Scotland and the Virginia Randolphs, but please let me know your thoughts below. Now, Thomas Jefferson himself also seemed to have a connection to Wales on his father's side, in the words of Jefferson himself. The tradition in my father's family was their ancestor came to this country from Wales, and from near the mountain of Snowdon, which is the highest mountain in Wales. His father, Peter Jefferson, also named one of his plantations Snowdon, a seeming reference to this Welsh ancestry. But what do we know about Thomas Jefferson's haplogroups? Well, he actually seemed to have a very unusual Y-DNA haplogroup for someone of European descent, namely haplogroup TM184, which confusingly was previously known as haplogroup K2. What is interesting is that haplogroup T is actually very rare in Europe today, and it's highest in East Africa. The origins of haplogroup T seem to be in the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. However, it is thought that it spread to other regions, such as Europe and Africa, with the spread of agriculture and the first farmers. On the maternal side, there again wasn't any research I could find on this, unfortunately. So overall, we can see that English ancestry is by far the most common lineage for the first 3 presidents of the US, with a little Welsh, French and Scottish connections mixed in as well though. Do you share any of those ancestries? Please let me know in the comments below and what your ancestry and haplogroups are if you know them. But speaking of England, what is the genetic history of England? To find out, please click here. Thanks for watching, please subscribe and hit the bell. If you would like to vote on what video topics I make videos on, please check out my Patreon page, I'll put a link below. And thanks to the patrons who voted for this video topic. But yeah, thanks again for watching, please let me know your thoughts below, and I'll see you next time.